Get this damn door off! Now!
That's it. You're under arrest.
The first call of the shift had been a false alarm. A nervous new mother convinced her baby's fever was a sign of something dire. The second was a routine transport, an elderly man with stable vitals heading to a follow-up appointment. The third call, the one that shattered the Tuesday morning calm, came in at 10:17 a.m. The voice from dispatch was tight, stripped of its usual professional distance. Unit 22, we have a multi-vehicle collision. Dale Mabry Highway just south of the I-275 interchange. Multiple injuries reported, one vehicle overturned. Respond code 3. David Carter gripped the steering wheel of Ambulance 22, his knuckles white. Beside him, his partner, Chris Riley, was already logging the call details into the onboard tablet. Code 3 on Dale Mabry, David said, his voice a low hum of focused energy. He flipped the switch, and the world outside the cab dissolved into a screaming symphony of siren and a flashing kaleidoscope of red and white light. The big diesel engine roared as he accelerated, expertly weaving through the Tampa traffic that parted before them like a metallic sea. David was 29 years old, with 6 years as a paramedic under his belt. Before that, he'd been a Navy corpsman, serving alongside Marines in places that made the chaos of a city highway feel like a walk in the park. He'd learned to compartmentalize, to see the human body not as a person full of hopes and fears, but as a complex system that he was trained to fix. It was a necessary detachment, a shield against the horror. He was calm under pressure, methodical in his approach, and exceptionally good at his job. He'd seen it all, or so he thought. They were on scene in under 4 minutes. The sight that greeted them was worse than dispatch had described. A 3-car pileup. A silver sedan was accordioned against the median, its front end unrecognizable. A blue pickup truck lay on its side, steam hissing from its mangled engine block. But it was the third vehicle, a dark green minivan, that held David's attention. It had rolled, coming to rest upside down in the middle of 2 lanes. The driver's side was crushed inward. "I'll take the minivan. You triage the sedan," David said to Chris, his voice sharp with command. He grabbed the primary trauma bag and the C-spine collar kit from the ambulance. The smell of gasoline and burnt rubber hung heavy in the humid Florida air. Glass crunched under his boots as he approached the wreck. He peered through the shattered rear window. A man, probably in his late 40s, was hanging upside down, held in place by his seatbelt. His face was a mask of blood, a deep gash bisecting his forehead. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and agonal. "Sir, can you hear me? My name is David. I'm a paramedic." No response. David knew every second was a battle against the cascade of failures shutting down the man's body. He needed to establish an airway, control the bleeding, and assess for internal injuries, all while the man was suspended in a metal cage. He called out his initial assessment to Chris, who was now working on a woman with a broken arm in the sedan. "Unresponsive male, late 40s, significant head trauma, compromised airway. I need the jaws and a backboard as soon as fire rescue gets here." He couldn't wait. He carefully crawled halfway into the vehicle through the broken window, contorting his body to get close to the patient. The inside of the minivan was a chaotic mess of deployed airbags, personal belongings, and the metallic tang of blood. He checked for a carotid pulse. It was there, but weak and thready. He expertly maneuvered himself to support the man's head and neck, holding C-spine stabilization with one hand while trying to clear the man's airway with the other. This was the delicate, terrifying dance of trauma care. One wrong move, one jostle of the spine, and he could paralyze the man for life. He was so focused, so deep inside the zone of medical protocol, that he barely registered the sound of another vehicle arriving. He heard a door slam, the heavy tread of boots on asphalt. It had to be the fire truck. "About time," he muttered, his attention locked on the gurgling sound coming from his patient's throat. "I need that airway cleared now." He was preparing to insert an oropharyngeal airway when a voice cut through his concentration. sharp and laced with an authority that had nothing to do with saving lives. "You need to move this ambulance, now!" David didn't look up. He couldn't. His hands were literally holding a man's life in place. "Fire rescue? I need the jaws on the driver's side door, and I need a hand getting him stabilized." "I'm not fire rescue," the voice snapped back, closer now. "I'm Officer Thorne, Tampa PD. Your truck is blocking a lane of traffic. Move it." For the first time, David allowed himself a flicker of annoyance. He could see the officer's polished black boots and blue trousers out of the corner of his eye. The request was so absurd, so completely disconnected from the life-and-death reality inside the mangled minivan that it barely registered as real. "Officer, I'm in the middle of patient care," David said, his voice strained from the awkward position. "This man is critical. My ambulance isn't going anywhere until we get him loaded." He was firm but professional. He'd dealt with cops on scene hundreds of times. They understood the hierarchy of an emergency. Medical needs came first, always. He returned his full attention to his patient, whose breathing was becoming more labored. He could hear the telltale signs of a developing tension pneumothorax, a collapsed lung that was compressing the heart. The clock was ticking. He didn't have time for this. He didn't have time for a cop on a power trip who was more concerned with traffic flow than a dying man. He just needed the fire department to arrive so they could cut the door off and extricate his patient. The sound of their sirens was now audible in the distance, a beacon of hope. Just a few more seconds. Officer Mark Thorne was 35 years old and had been with the Tampa Police Department for 7 years. He carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who believed the badge and the gun on his hip made him the final arbiter of any situation. He had a reputation within the department for being by the book to a fault, a stickler for procedure who saw the world in black and white, lawful and unlawful. To his supporters, he was a diligent officer. To his detractors, he was an inflexible bully who lacked the common sense to see the gray areas inherent in policing. He'd racked up a handful of citizen complaints over the years for excessive force during a protest, for an overly aggressive traffic stop, but each one had been quietly cleared by internal affairs. The blue line protected its own. When Thorne arrived on the scene of the Dale Mabry pileup, his training took over. He saw not a human tragedy, but a logistical problem. His primary objective was to secure the scene and restore order. And the first thing that broke the pattern of order in his eyes was Ambulance 22. It was parked at an angle, straddling 2 lanes of the highway, its rear doors facing the overturned minivan. To a paramedic, it was positioned for the most rapid and efficient patient loading possible. To Mark Thorne, it was an obstruction. He strode past the crumpled sedan where Chris was calmly wrapping a woman's arm, his eyes locked on the ambulance. He saw David, a black man in a paramedic's uniform, half disappeared inside the wreckage of the minivan. Thorne didn't see the patient. He didn't register the blood, the twisted metal, or the quiet desperation of the scene. He saw a vehicle improperly parked. His vehicle. His scene. "I'm not going to tell you again," Thorne said, his voice rising, drawing the attention of the other crash victims who were now huddled on the shoulder of the road. "Move this ambulance! You're impeding the flow of traffic!" From inside the car, David felt a surge of disbelief mixed with a rising tide of anger. He kept his voice level. "Officer, with all due respect, the flow of traffic is not my primary concern right now. This man is dying. He has a probable tension pneumothorax and a severe head injury. I am manually stabilizing his spine. If I move, he could be permanently paralyzed or die. Do you understand?" He enunciated each word clearly, trying to cut through whatever procedural fog had clouded the officer's judgment. Thorne took a step closer to the minivan, his hand resting on his service weapon in a gesture that was meant to be casual, but was perceived as anything but. "I understand that you're refusing a lawful order. I am the ranking law enforcement officer on this scene. My orders are not suggestions." The fire truck was pulling up now, its air brakes hissing. 2 firefighters, grizzled veterans named Miller and Sanchez, jumped out and were already grabbing the hydraulic rescue tools. They saw the scene, David in the car, Thorne standing over him, and immediately grasped the dynamic. "What's the problem, Thorne?" Miller asked, his eyes on David. "What do you need, paramedic?" "I need this door off now," David yelled, his focus snapping back to the patient. "He's crashing!" Thorne stepped between Miller and the minivan. "Hold on, this scene is not secure." Miller, a man who had seen more wreckage than Thorne had seen traffic stops, stared at him in disbelief. "Are you kidding me? There's a man dying in there. Get out of the way." "This paramedic is refusing to follow orders," Thorne said, his voice cold and defensive. He felt his authority being challenged, not just by the paramedic, but now by the fire department. It was a challenge he couldn't abide. He turned his attention back to David. "I'm giving you one last chance. Get out of that vehicle and move your ambulance, or you're going to be placed under arrest for obstruction." The word arrest hung in the air, a stunning, surreal escalation. The other drivers, the firefighters, Chris, they all froze. It was unthinkable. A cop arresting a paramedic during a life-saving intervention. It just didn't happen. David, still twisted in the wreckage, his muscles screaming in protest from holding the patient's head steady, made a choice. He was a paramedic. His duty was to his patient. The law, ethics, and every fiber of his being told him that the man bleeding out in front of him was the only thing that mattered. "Go to hell," David said, his voice a low, furious growl. He didn't shout it. He said it with the chilling finality of a man who had been pushed past his limit. He then turned his head slightly toward the firefighters. "Miller, get this damn door off, now!" That was it. The final rejection of his authority. Thorne's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. He saw David's response not as a paramedic's desperate plea to save a life, but as a direct, personal insult. It was insubordination. And in his world, insubordination had to be crushed. "That's it," Thorne said, unclipping his handcuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest." He reached into the shattered window frame and grabbed David's arm. "You're interfering with my investigation." "Investigation?" David yelled, trying to twist away without letting go of his patient. "This is a medical rescue, you idiot! There's no crime here!" But Thorne was strong, his grip like a vice. The standoff had become a physical altercation, a complete breakdown of interagency cooperation, all because one officer couldn't stand being told no. The moment Officer Thorne's hand clamped down on David's arm, the scene fractured. The firefighters, Miller and Sanchez, stood frozen for a half-second, their heavy rescue tools dangling from their hands, their minds struggling to process the insanity unfolding before them. Chris Riley, David's partner, took an instinctive step forward, his hands raised. "Officer, wait! You can't do this! He's treating a critical patient!" Thorne ignored him. His entire focus narrowed to a single point, the paramedic who had defied him. The public challenge to his authority had triggered a visceral, almost reptilian part of his brain. This was no longer about a misplaced ambulance. It was about dominance. "Get out of the vehicle now!" he commanded, his voice a low growl. He yanked on David's arm. Inside the crushed minivan, David was in an impossible position. He was trying to maintain C-spine stabilization on an unconscious man, while another uniformed professional was actively trying to rip him away. The patient let out a low, gurgling moan, a sound that sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through David's system. "Let go of me!" David shouted, his professional calm finally shattering. "You're going to kill him!" "You should have thought of that before you decided to obstruct justice," Thorne retorted, the legalistic phrase sounding utterly absurd in the context of the bloody, mangled scene. He pulled again, harder this time. The sudden movement caused David's hand to slip. The patient's head lolled unnaturally to the side for a split second before David could regain his grip. It was a catastrophic failure in protocol, forced upon him by Thorne. A wave of hot, sick dread washed over David. A potential C-spine injury had just become a probable one. "You see what you just did?" David's voice was hoarse with a mixture of rage and fear. "You may have just paralyzed him. For what? For a damn parking spot?" The accusation seemed to bounce off Thorne's armor of self-righteousness. He saw only continued defiance. The firefighters, snapping out of their shock, finally moved. Sanchez dropped his tool and rushed to the minivan. "I've got his head, David. Let me take over," he said, his voice a calming baritone amid the chaos. He carefully slid his hands into place, taking over the C-spine stabilization. "Go! We've got the patient." For a moment, David hesitated, unwilling to abandon his patient. But Thorne's grip was relentless, and Sanchez was a trained first responder. The patient was in capable hands. With his primary duty transferred, David stopped resisting Thorne's pull. He carefully extracted himself from the wreckage, his body aching, his mind reeling. The moment he was clear of the vehicle, Thorne spun him around with surprising force, slamming him against the side of the overturned minivan. The impact drove the air from his lungs. "Turn around, hands behind your back." "This is insane," David gasped, but he complied. He knew resisting would only make it worse, would give Thorne the satisfaction he craved. He placed his hands behind his back, the rough metal of the wreck scraping against his cheek. The other crash victims were watching, their cell phones out, recording. David was dimly aware of the small, circular lenses pointed at him, documenting his humiliation. The handcuffs were cold and heavy. Thorne cinched them down with a practiced, deliberate tightness, the metal biting into the flesh of David's wrists. Then came the click. A sharp, metallic sound that seemed to echo across the highway. The final, irrevocable sound of a line being crossed. The click of cold steel that transformed David Carter, paramedic, from a healer into a prisoner. Thorne began his perfunctory pat-down, his hands moving over David's uniform. "You have the right to remain silent," he recited, the words rote and devoid of meaning. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." David wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the minivan, on the firefighters now working frantically with the jaws of life to peel the door away. He saw Chris rush over with a backboard and stretcher. They were moving with a desperate urgency, an urgency necessitated by the minutes Thorne had stolen from them. Those were his minutes, his patient, his responsibility. And he was standing here in handcuffs being read his rights for doing his job. "What are the charges?" David asked, his voice flat, hollowed out by the sheer surreality of it all. "Obstruction of a government official and resisting an officer without violence," Thorne said, pulling David away from the minivan and marching him toward his patrol car. "You should have just moved the truck." The words were so simple, so inadequate to capture the magnitude of what had just happened. Thorne genuinely believed he was in the right. He had given a lawful order, and it had been refused. In his rigid, procedural mind, the context, the dying man, the medical imperative, was irrelevant noise. He had asserted his authority, and that was all that mattered. As he pushed David toward the back of the cruiser, David looked back one last time. He saw the firefighters finally get the patient out, strapped to a backboard, a neck brace in place. They were moving fast, but they had lost time. Precious, irreplaceable time. And the cost of that lost time, David knew, would be measured in blood. The back of a police cruiser is a sterile, impersonal space, a hard plastic bench, a thick plexiglass partition, and a metal cage over the windows. It's designed to contain, to isolate, to dehumanize. For David Carter, it felt like a fishbowl. He sat, his cuffed hands in his lap, the Florida sun beating down on the roof of the car, turning the small space into an oven. Through the rear window, he had a perfect, terrible view of the scene he'd been ripped from. He watched as his own ambulance, Unit 22, finally pulled away, Chris at the wheel. But it wasn't his patient in the back. Chris was transporting the woman with the broken arm from the sedan. She was stable, a low-priority transport. His patient, the man from the minivan, Robert Miller, he'd heard one of the firefighters use the name, was still on the highway. Another ambulance, Unit 41, had arrived and was now taking over his care. David watched with a professional, critical eye, his training overriding the hot shame of his situation. He saw the new paramedic team work, They were good, but they were starting from zero. They hadn't done the initial assessment. They hadn't been the ones to first hear the telltale signs of the collapsed lung. They were catching up, and in trauma care, catching up was a losing game. The delay was compounding. First, the minutes Thorne had wasted arguing. Now, the minutes lost in the handoff between ambulance crews. David did the math in his head. At least 7, maybe 8 minutes of critical care vanished. He saw them finally get Robert Miller loaded into the back of Unit 41. The doors slammed shut, and a moment later it sped away, sirens screaming, lights flashing, a desperate race to Tampa General Hospital. A race that should have started 10 minutes earlier. A knot of cold dread tightened in David's stomach. He had done everything he could, followed his training to the letter, prioritized his patient above all else, and the result was this. Helplessly watching from a cage while another crew tried to clean up the mess. Officer Thorne climbed into the driver's seat, the car dipping with his weight. He didn't look back at David. He started the engine, and the air conditioning blasted on, a welcome but unsettling relief. He got on the radio, his voice the epitome of calm, bureaucratic efficiency. "Dispatch, be advised. 1 in custody from the scene at Dale Mabry, transporting to central booking." The silence that followed stretched, thick with unspoken animosity. David decided to break it. He had to. "You know you just signed that man's death warrant, right?" he said, his voice steady, devoid of the anger he felt. It was a statement of fact. Thorne adjusted his rearview mirror, his eyes meeting David's in the reflection for a brief, cold moment. "The only person responsible for your situation is you. All you had to do was comply." "Comply? My job is to save lives, not to make yours easier. There's a hierarchy of needs at a trauma scene. A clear airway takes precedence over traffic flow. A beating heart takes precedence over your ego. That's day 1 at the academy for you and for me." Thorne's jaw tightened. He hated being lectured, especially by someone he had just arrested. "You're not in a position to be telling me how to do my job, paramedic. You're a suspect in a criminal investigation." The drive to the Orient Road jail felt like an eternity. They passed familiar Tampa landmarks, Raymond James Stadium, the storefronts on Columbus Drive, but they seemed alien to David, part of a world he no longer inhabited. He was in Thorne's world now, a world of handcuffs and holding cells. He focused on his breathing, using the same techniques he taught to panicked patients. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Stay calm. Assess. Don't let him see you sweat. He thought about the consequences, his career, his paramedic license. He had a clean record, a history of excellent performance reviews. But an arrest, especially for resisting an officer, was a black mark that might be impossible to erase. He thought about his wife, Sarah, a nurse at St. Joseph's. How was he going to explain this to her? How could he make her understand that he'd been arrested for doing the very thing he'd sworn an oath to do? He knew there were witnesses, the other drivers, the firefighters. He knew their cell phone videos would surface. He hoped they would show the truth, that they would vindicate him. But he'd also seen how things like this could be twisted. He was a black man who had argued with a white police officer. He knew how that narrative could be spun, how his professional assertiveness could be reframed as aggression, his refusal to abandon a patient as insubordination. When they pulled into the sally port of the jail, the big metal door rolling shut behind them, the sense of finality was overwhelming. This was real. He was being booked into jail. Thorne led him out of the car, his hand firmly on David's arm, guiding him toward a set of heavy steel doors. As they walked through the sterile corridors, the smell of antiseptic and stale coffee filled the air. Other officers looked up, their faces a mixture of curiosity and indifference. To them, he was just another body in the system, another file to be processed. The man who, an hour ago, was holding a stranger's life in his hands was now just a number. The booking area of the Orient Road jail was a place stripped of all humanity. It was a conveyor belt of misery, designed for maximum efficiency and minimum dignity. The walls were cinder block painted a dull, institutional gray. The floor was scuffed linoleum. The air hummed with the fluorescent lights overhead and the low murmur of official conversations. For David, stepping into this room was like crossing a threshold into another dimension. "Got a live one for you, Mike," Officer Thorne said to the booking sergeant, a heavy-set, world-weary man named Costello who looked like he'd seen it all twice. Costello glanced up from his computer, his eyes taking in David's paramedic uniform, the bloodstains on the sleeve, the raw anger simmering just beneath his composed exterior. He looked at Thorne, then back at David, and a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or just plain confusion, crossed his face. "A paramedic? What'd he do? Steal the good drugs?" "Obstruction and resisting without violence," Thorne said, handing over a preliminary arrest report. "He was interfering at the scene of a major MVA on Dale Mabry." Costello took the report, his eyes scanning the page. He grunted. "Okay, let's get him processed." The indignity began. Thorne unlocked David's handcuffs only to replace them with a chain attached to a metal bench. David sat, watching as Thorne filled out more paperwork, his pen scratching across the forms with a self-satisfied finality. This was the official record, Thorne's version of events, a narrative that would paint David as an uncooperative agitator and Thorne as a peacekeeper restoring order. It was a fiction, but it was a fiction that was now being entered into the permanent record of the state of Florida. Finally, a deputy called his name. "Carter, David, on your feet." He was led to the first station, personal property. He had to empty his pockets, his wallet, his keys, his phone. The deputy, a young man who looked barely out of his teens, cataloged each item with bored detachment. He pulled out David's wallet and removed the contents. A driver's license, a few credit cards, a picture of his wife, Sarah, and behind it, his collection of certifications, his state paramedic license, his ACLS and PALS cards, his National Registry certification. The young deputy paused, looking at the impressive stack of credentials that represented years of training and thousands of hours of dedication. He looked up at David, then over at Thorne, who was watching from a distance, arms crossed. The deputy said nothing, but his expression softened almost imperceptibly. This wasn't their usual clientele. Next came the fingerprints. The deputy rolled each of David's fingers in black ink and pressed them onto a card, a procedure both intimate and profoundly alienating. These were the hands that had started IVs, performed chest compressions, held the hands of the dying. Now, their unique whorls and ridges were being entered into a criminal database. Then, the photograph, the mugshot. "Stand against the wall, face forward, now turn to the side." The flash was blinding. In that split second, the camera captured not just his image, but his exhaustion, his fury, his utter disbelief. He was no longer David Carter, paramedic. He was inmate number 2026-008743. He was allowed one phone call. He dialed his wife's number, his hands shaking slightly as he punched the buttons. She answered on the second ring, her voice cheerful. "Hey, honey, how's the shift going?" How could he possibly answer that? "Sarah," he began, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat. "Listen, something's happened. I'm at the Orient Road jail." The silence on the other end of the line was a physical thing. He could feel her shock, her confusion. "What? What are you talking about? Is this a joke?" "No, I've been arrested." "Arrested? For what?" Her voice was rising, laced with panic. "It's a long story. I was on a call, a bad one. A cop and I had a disagreement. He arrested me for obstruction." "Obstruction? You were helping someone." "I know. Listen, I don't have much time. Can you call the union? Talk to Frank Miller, our rep. Tell him what happened. Tell him I'm at Orient Road. They'll know what to do." Okay, I'll call him right now. David, are you okay?" "I'm fine," he lied. "Just get this handled. I love you." "I love you too," she whispered, and the line went dead. He hung up the phone, feeling more alone than he ever had in his life. He'd put on a brave face for Sarah, but inside, a cold fear was beginning to set in. He was trapped in a system that wasn't designed to listen, a bureaucratic labyrinth where the truth was often the first casualty. He had been stripped of his name, his profession, his freedom. All that was left was a uniform, a number, and the burning, righteous anger of a man who had been punished for doing the right thing. He was led to a holding cell, the heavy door clanging shut behind him, the sound sealing him in the gray, unforgiving world of the justice system. The holding cell was a concrete box. A metal bench was bolted to the wall, and a toilet and sink combination stood in the corner. The air was stale, thick with the ghosts of 1,000 other people's despair. David sat on the bench, his back against the cool concrete, and replayed the morning's events in his head, searching for a moment where he could have done something differently. Should he have been more deferential to Thorne? Should he have tried to explain the patient's condition in simpler terms? No. He came to the same conclusion every time. He had acted correctly. His every decision had been dictated by his training and his duty to his patient. The fault was not his. But in this concrete box, that knowledge was cold comfort. The system didn't care about his intentions. It only cared about the report Thorne had filed. He'd been in the cell for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than 2 hours when he heard footsteps approaching. It wasn't the shuffling gait of a deputy on his rounds. It was a sharp, purposeful click of heels on the linoleum floor. A woman appeared outside the bars of his cell. She was in her late 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense haircut. She was dressed in a tailored business suit that seemed wildly out of place in the grim surroundings of the jail. She carried a leather briefcase. "David Carter?" she asked, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Yes," he said, standing up. "My name is Jessica Hayes. I'm an attorney. Your union rep, Frank Miller, called me as soon as he got off the phone with your wife. He sends his apologies that he can't be here himself. He's tied up in a contract negotiation across town. He asked me to come down here and get you out." A wave of relief, so powerful it almost made him dizzy, washed over David. He wasn't alone anymore.
Thank you for coming.
"Don't thank me yet," she said, pulling a legal pad and a pen from her briefcase. "First, you're going to tell me everything that happened, from the moment you got the call to the moment they shut this door. Don't leave out a single detail. Don't editorialize, just give me the facts." For the next half hour, David recounted the story. He described the scene on Dale Mabry, the condition of his patient, Robert Miller, the escalating demands from Officer Thorne, the moment of the arrest, and the conversation in the patrol car. Jessica Hayes listened intently, her pen flying across the page, occasionally stopping him to ask a clarifying question. "Did he ever ask about the patient's condition before demanding you move the ambulance?" she asked. "No, his only concern was the position of the vehicle." "And you explained the medical necessity of your position?" "Multiple times. I told him the patient was critical, that I was maintaining C-spine stabilization, that moving could cause further injury." "Were there witnesses?" "Yes. My partner, Chris Riley, 2 firefighters from Tampa Fire Rescue, Miller and Sanchez, and at least a half-dozen civilians who were recording on their phones." A thin smile touched Jessica's lips. "Good. That's very good." She finished her notes and looked up at him, her expression one of steely confidence. "Okay, Mr. Carter, here's what's going to happen. This arrest is a sham. It's a classic case of what we call contempt of cop. The officer felt his authority was challenged and he retaliated. The charges he filed, obstruction and resisting without violence, are preposterous. You were engaged in your official duties as a paramedic, performing a life-saving procedure. Under Florida law, that gives you a certain amount of authority on an emergency scene. In fact, it's far more likely that he was the one guilty of obstruction by interfering with emergency medical services. Hearing his own convictions echoed by a legal professional was incredibly validating. "So what do we do?" "First, I'm going to talk to the duty sergeant and arrange for your release. This is a misdemeanor charge. They should release you on your own recognizance. Second, I'll be on the phone with the state attorney's office first thing in the morning. I'll make it very clear to them that if they proceed with these charges, we will not only fight them, but we will file a motion to dismiss based on prosecutorial misconduct and sue Officer Thorne and the city of Tampa into the Stone Age. My guess is they'll drop the charges before the ink on the arrest report is even dry. They don't want the headache, and they certainly don't want the publicity that will come when those cell phone videos hit the news. She exuded an aura of such competence and control that David felt the knot of fear in his chest finally begin to loosen. What about my job? My license? The union will handle that, she said. Frank is already talking to your superiors. Given the circumstances and the witness accounts from the firefighters, I highly doubt there will be any professional repercussions. You were doing your job. In fact, you were doing it exceptionally well under impossible circumstances. She tapped her pen on her notepad. The real issue here isn't the criminal charge. That's a nuisance we'll swat away. The real issue is the patient. We need to find out what happened to him. The gravity in her voice was a stark reminder of the true stakes of the morning's events. It wasn't just about David's freedom, it was about Robert Miller's life. True to her word, Jessica Hayes had David released within the hour. The process was anticlimactic. A deputy unlocked his cell, led him back to the property room to retrieve his wallet and phone, and pointed him toward the exit. Stepping out of the air-conditioned chill of the jail into the thick, humid heat of the Tampa afternoon was a jarring transition. He felt grimy, exhausted, and fundamentally changed by the experience. His wife, Sarah, was waiting for him in the parking lot, her face etched with worry. She ran to him, wrapping him in a fierce hug. He buried his face in her shoulder, inhaling the familiar scent of her perfume, a scent of home and sanity in a world that had gone completely mad. "I was so worried," she whispered. "I'm okay," he said, though it wasn't entirely true. "Let's just go home." The first thing he did when he walked through his front door was take a long, hot shower, trying to scrub the feel of the jail from his skin. But it was more than just a physical grime. It was a psychic stain, a feeling of violation that he knew would linger. When he came out, Sarah had a glass of water for him and his phone, which had been buzzing non-stop. There were dozens of texts and missed calls from friends, co-workers, and his union rep, Frank. The story was already spreading through the tight-knit community of Tampa's first responders. He ignored them for a moment and focused on the one thing that mattered most. "I need to know about my patient," he told Sarah. "The man in the minivan. His name is Robert Miller." Sarah, ever the resourceful nurse, was already on it. "I made some calls to a friend in the ER at Tampa General," she said, her voice gentle. "It's not good, David." He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. "Tell me." "He arrived in critical condition. He coded in the trauma bay. They managed to get him back, but just barely. He had a massive tension pneumothorax, the collapsed lung you suspected, and a significant epidural hematoma, bleeding in his brain. The delay in getting him to the hospital, the surgeon said it made a huge difference." David closed his eyes, the words hitting him like a physical blow. He had known it. He had felt it in his gut from the moment Thorne pulled him away. The lost minutes, the handoff between crews. What did the delay do? The pressure from the collapsed lung put immense strain on his heart, leading to the cardiac arrest. And the longer the bleed in his brain went untreated, the more pressure built up inside his skull, causing more damage. They took him straight to emergency surgery to relieve the pressure and repair the lung. He's in a medically induced coma in the surgical ICU right now. They're saying it's touch and go. The next 48 hours will be critical. The weight of it was crushing. It wasn't an abstract legal problem anymore. It was a man, a husband, a father. He'd seen a child's car seat in the back of the minivan, fighting for his life because of Mark Thorne's ego. David's hands clenched into fists. The anger he'd been suppressing all day came roaring back, hot and pure. He finally called Frank Miller, the union rep. Frank's voice was a mix of outrage and reassurance. "David, I've already spoken to Chief Anderson at Fire Rescue. You have our full and unconditional support. You are not to worry about your job. We've also got statements from Chris, Miller, and Sanchez. They all back you 100%. They're furious. What about Thorne? David asked. The firefighters' union has already filed a formal complaint against him with Tampa PD's internal affairs. This isn't going to be swept under the rug. But Jessica Hayes thinks we need to go further. What does she mean? She's talking about a lawsuit, David, a federal civil rights lawsuit against Officer Thorne and the city, for false arrest, for violation of your constitutional rights, and for interference with emergency medical services. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a malicious abuse of power, and Robert Miller is the one paying the price for it. A lawsuit. The idea had been a distant possibility, but now it was becoming real. It meant depositions, courtrooms, a long, drawn-out fight. He was tired. He just wanted to go back to his life, to his job. But then he thought of Robert Miller, lying in a hospital bed, tubes and wires keeping him alive. He thought of Thorne, who was probably back on patrol, convinced he had done the right thing. "Okay," David said, his voice firm with a newfound resolve. "Let's do it. He can't be allowed to get away with this." It wasn't about him anymore. It was about Robert Miller. It was about every paramedic who had ever been bullied or intimidated by an officer who didn't understand the sanctity of their work. It was about drawing a line in the sand, a line that said patient care comes first, always. Within a week, the criminal charges against David were officially dropped. Just as Jessica Hayes had predicted, the state attorney's office took one look at the witness list, 2 firefighters, another paramedic, and the looming media storm, and decided it was a fight they couldn't win. It was a small victory, a brief moment of vindication, but it was only the beginning. The following Monday, Jessica filed a comprehensive civil rights lawsuit in the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Florida. The defendants were listed as Officer Mark Thorne and his employer, the City of Tampa. The complaint was a masterclass in legal precision. It laid out the facts of the case in stark, undeniable detail, citing Florida statutes regarding a paramedic's duty to provide care and the laws against interfering with emergency personnel. It alleged violations of David's Fourth Amendment rights against unlawful seizure and his 14th Amendment right to due process. Most damningly, it detailed how Thorne's actions directly led to a catastrophic delay in medical care for a critically injured patient. The lawsuit immediately made headlines. The local news channels, which had already aired the cell phone footage captured by bystanders, ran segments featuring interviews with legal experts and retired police chiefs, most of whom were appalled by Thorne's conduct. The story was a perfect storm. A hero paramedic arrested while saving a life by a seemingly out-of-control police officer. The City of Tampa's initial response was a boilerplate statement expressing their commitment to public safety and promising a full investigation. Behind the scenes, however, their legal department went into damage control mode. They knew the optics were terrible. The video evidence was damning. They had a choice: either admit fault and try to make things right, or dig in their heels and defend their officer. They chose the latter. Their first move was to try and make the problem go away quietly. 2 weeks after the suit was filed, a lawyer from the city attorney's office called Jessica Hayes. He was smooth, conciliatory, and utterly dismissive. "Jessica, we've reviewed the case," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Obviously, there was a misunderstanding at the scene, a lot of confusion, emotions running high. We're prepared to offer your client a settlement to make this whole thing disappear. Let's say $25,000 for his trouble." Jessica muted the phone and let out a short, sharp laugh of disbelief. She unmuted it, her voice turning to ice. "25,000? Is that what you think a man's civil rights are worth in this city? Is that the price for nearly letting a man die on the highway so your officer could flex his authority? You're insulting my client, and you're insulting my intelligence." "It's a nuisance value offer, Jessica, a gesture of goodwill." "Here's my gesture of goodwill," she shot back. "We'll see you in discovery. We're going to depose your officer. We're going to get his body camera footage. We're going to pull every citizen complaint ever filed against him. We're going to get the dispatch logs, the ambulance telemetry data, and the sworn testimony of every firefighter and witness on that scene. And when we're done, we're not going to be talking about $25,000. We're going to be talking about a number with a lot more zeros. She hung up the phone. The city's arrogance was breathtaking. They weren't seeing this as a grave injustice that needed to be rectified. They saw it as a public relations problem that could be solved with a small check. They were protecting their employee, defending the institution at all costs. They had fundamentally misjudged David Carter, and they had profoundly underestimated Jessica Hayes. When Jessica relayed the offer to David, he felt a fresh wave of anger. "They think they can buy me off for the price of a used car?" he said. "This was never about the money. This is about accountability." "That's what I told them," Jessica said with a grim smile. "So we fight. It's going to be a long road. They'll try to dig into your past, try to paint you as a hothead, try to find any little thing to discredit you. Are you ready for that?" David thought of Robert Miller, who had finally emerged from his coma, but was facing a long and arduous recovery. He had suffered some permanent cognitive damage from the brain bleed and had a long road of physical therapy ahead of him. His life, and his family's life, had been irrevocably altered. "I'm ready," David said. "Let's get to work." The city had drawn its battle lines. They thought their position was entrenched, their blue wall impenetrable. They were about to find out how wrong they were. Discovery is the phase of a lawsuit where both sides are forced to show their cards. It's a painstaking process of exchanging documents, answering written questions, and most importantly, conducting depositions, sworn testimony given under oath outside of court. The deposition of Officer Mark Thorne was scheduled 4 months after the lawsuit was filed. It took place in a sterile conference room in a downtown Tampa office building. David was there, sitting beside his attorney, Jessica Hayes. He was required to be present, but his role was to be a silent observer. Across the long mahogany table sat Officer Thorne, looking confident and slightly defiant in a crisp suit, flanked by the city's attorney and a lawyer from the police union. A court reporter sat at the head of the table, her fingers poised over her stenotype machine, ready to capture every word. Jessica began the deposition calmly, almost gently. She started with Thorne's background, his training, his years on the force. Thorne's answers were short and confident. He presented himself as a competent, experienced officer. Then, Jessica moved to the day of the incident. "Officer Thorne, could you describe the scene as you saw it when you first arrived on Dale Mabry Highway?" "It was chaotic," Thorne said. "Multiple vehicles, multiple victims. My first priority was to secure the scene and ensure the safety of the public and the other responders." "And what was the first action you took to secure the scene?" Jessica asked, her tone neutral. "I observed that an ambulance was parked in a manner that was obstructing a lane of traffic, preventing other emergency vehicles from accessing the scene and creating a hazard." "So, your primary concern upon arriving at a multi-vehicle accident with an overturned minivan and critically injured people was the parking job of the ambulance." The city attorney objected. "Argumentative!" "I'll rephrase," Jessica said smoothly. "Did you assess any of the victims before you approached the paramedic, Mr. Carter?" "I was conducting a global assessment of the entire scene," Thorne said, falling back on police jargon. "Did you look inside the overturned minivan?" "From my vantage point, I could see that the paramedic was with the patient." "So you did not personally observe the patient, Robert Miller?" "No, the paramedic was in the way." Jessica paused, letting the implication of his words hang in the air. "Mr. Carter was in the way of you seeing the patient." "His body was positioned inside the vehicle," Thorne clarified, a hint of irritation in his voice. "Because he was rendering aid, correct?" "He stated he was rendering aid." The insinuation was clear. Thorne was suggesting David might have been lying or exaggerating. David felt his hands clench under the table, but he kept his expression impassive, just as Jessica had instructed. Jessica pressed on, her questions becoming more pointed. Did Mr. Carter explain to you why the ambulance was positioned where it was? He said something about the patient being critical. Did he tell you he was manually stabilizing the patient's cervical spine? He said a lot of things. He was being uncooperative. Is it uncooperative for a paramedic to prioritize treating a dying patient over moving a vehicle, officer? Objection, the city attorney snapped. Counsel is badgering the witness. The witness can answer the question, Jessica said, her eyes locked on Thorne. Thorne straightened his tie. The witness was refusing to follow a lawful order. It's that simple. For 3 hours, Jessica meticulously picked apart Thorne's narrative. She used his own police department's manual of procedures against him, pointing out the sections that called for cooperation with other emergency services. She forced him to admit that he had no medical training beyond basic CPR. She made him concede that he never once asked David about the patient's specific injuries or vital signs. The turning point came when Jessica asked about Thorne's decision to make the arrest. Officer, what, in your mind, was the crime Mr. Carter had committed? Obstruction of a government official. And which government official was he obstructing? Me. And what official duty were you performing that he was obstructing? I was attempting to clear a lane of traffic to secure the accident scene. So you arrested a paramedic who was actively engaged in a life-saving procedure on a critically injured man because he was interfering with your ability to direct traffic. When she framed it so starkly, the absurdity of his position became undeniable. Thorne's confidence began to crack. He fidgeted in his chair. His answers became shorter, more evasive. He was challenging my authority, he finally admitted, his voice low. Jessica leaned forward slightly. So this wasn't about traffic flow, was it, Officer Thorne? It was about the fact that a paramedic told you no. Thorne's face flushed with anger. He was insubordinate. There it was, the truth, stripped bare. It had never been about the ambulance. It had never been about public safety. It had been about a police officer's fragile ego and his inability to tolerate a challenge to his authority. The deposition wouldn't win the case on its own, but it had exposed the rotten foundation upon which the city's entire defense was built. As the court reporter typed, David knew that Thorne's own words had just become the most powerful weapon in their arsenal. If Officer Thorne's deposition revealed the flawed motive behind the arrest, his body camera footage provided the undeniable, objective proof. The city's lawyers had tried to delay turning it over, filing motions and claiming technical difficulties, but Jessica Hayes had been relentless. After weeks of legal wrangling, a digital file finally arrived at her office. She, David, and a forensic video analyst sat in a darkened conference room to watch it for the first time. Okay, David, Jessica said gently. This is going to be difficult to watch, but we need to go through it, second by second. The video began with the jerky motion of Thorne getting out of his patrol car. The audio was clear, capturing the ambient sounds of the highway, the hiss of steam, the distant traffic. Thorne's breathing was audible as he walked toward the scene. The camera panned across the wreckage, briefly showing the crumpled sedan before focusing, with an almost magnetic pull, on Ambulance 22. You need to move this ambulance, now! Thorne's voice boomed from the speakers, and David felt a jolt, as if he were right back there on the asphalt. The camera moved closer, peering into the shattered window of the minivan. For the first time, David saw the scene from Thorne's perspective. He saw himself contorted inside the car, his hands covered in blood, his face a mask of intense concentration. He saw the patient, Robert Miller, hanging upside down, his face pale and slack. The critical nature of the situation was obvious, undeniable to any rational observer. They watched the entire confrontation unfold. They heard David's calm, professional explanations. Officer, I'm in the middle of patient care. This man is critical. They heard Thorne's escalating aggression. I am the ranking law enforcement officer on this scene. My orders are not suggestions. The video captured it all. The arrival of the firefighters, Thorne physically blocking them, his hand resting on his gun, The final, fateful exchange. "Go to hell!" David's voice growled from the speakers, raw with desperation. And then Thorne's reaction, grabbing David's arm, yanking him from the vehicle. The most damning part was the audio. With the video analyst's software, they were able to enhance the sound from inside the minivan. They could clearly hear Robert Miller's agonal breathing, the gurgling sound that signaled a compromised airway. It was the sound of a man drowning in his own fluids. Any trained first responder, police included, should have recognized it as a sign of extreme medical distress. Thorne had either not heard it, or he had heard it and chosen to ignore it. Neither possibility was good for him. The footage continued, showing Thorne spinning David against the car, the sharp click of the handcuffs, the recitation of the Miranda rights as the firefighters worked frantically in the background. The camera's unblinking eye had recorded Thorne's complete and utter disregard for the medical emergency unfolding just feet away from him. His focus was entirely on subduing David, on processing his prisoner. They watched until the end, until Thorne placed David in the back of his cruiser and shut the door. Jessica clicked off the monitor, and the room was plunged into silence. "Well," she said, her voice grim, "that's our case." The body camera footage became the centerpiece of their legal strategy. It was irrefutable. It couldn't be cross-examined. It didn't have a faulty memory. It simply showed what had happened. It transformed the case from a he said dispute into a documented abuse of power. When the city's attorneys saw the footage, they knew they were in trouble. They had been relying on Thorne's report, on his narrative of an uncooperative paramedic creating a hazard. The video told a different story. It told the story of a paramedic fighting to save a life, and a police officer who was dangerously obsessed with asserting his dominance. Another settlement offer came in. This time, it was for $250,000. It was a significant jump, a clear signal that the city was beginning to understand the weakness of its position. Jessica called David to relay the offer. "They're getting nervous," she said. David didn't even hesitate. He thought about the video, about the sound of Robert Miller struggling to breathe. He thought about the man's family, who were now facing a lifetime of caretaking for their loved one. "No," David said. "It's not enough. It's not just about the money. We have to make sure this never happens again." Jessica had been hoping he would say that. "I agree," she said. "We're taking this to trial." The city had given them the gun, and the body camera footage was the bullet. Now, they were going to fire it. While the body camera footage provided the visual drama, the dispatch recordings from that morning painted an equally damning picture through audio alone. As part of discovery, Jessica Hayes subpoenaed every recording related to the incident. The initial 911 calls, the dispatch to Ambulance 22, and most critically, the radio traffic between Officer Thorne and the central dispatcher. Listening to the tapes was an eerie experience. It was like hearing the anatomy of a disaster being built, piece by piece, in cold, professional language. The first part was routine, the calm voice of the dispatcher sending David's unit to the scene, David's partner Chris acknowledging the call. Then came the recordings from the scene itself. The first sign of trouble was a call from Chris. His voice was strained, a stark contrast to his usual calm demeanor. "Dispatch, be advised, we have a law enforcement officer on scene interfering with patient care. We have a critical trauma patient, and the officer is demanding we move the ambulance." The dispatcher's voice registered confusion. "Unit 22, can you repeat that? You have an officer interfering?" "Affirmative," Chris said. "He is threatening to arrest my partner who is actively treating the patient." A pause followed on the tape, a few seconds of dead air that spoke volumes. The dispatcher was likely trying to figure out how to handle an unprecedented situation. Finally, her voice came back. "Unit 22, is the officer a Tampa PD unit?" "Affirmative. We need a supervisor on scene immediately." This recording was crucial. It provided a real-time, third-party account of Thorne's interference, logged before the arrest even happened. It completely undermined the city's narrative that David had been the aggressor or the one escalating the situation. But the most chilling recording was from Thorne's own radio. After the initial chaos, after he had David in custody, he got on the radio to report the arrest. His voice was the opposite of Chris's. It was unnaturally calm, steady, almost robotic. "Dispatch, Unit 341, Thorne said. "Show me on scene at the Dale Mabry MVA. I have one adult male in custody." "Unit 341, copy. What are the charges?" the dispatcher asked. "Obstruction of a government official and resisting without violence." 10-4, Unit 341. "Can you advise the suspect's identity?" "Suspect is a paramedic with Tampa Fire Rescue," Thorne said, without a hint of irony or hesitation in his voice. Hearing Thorne label him a suspect on the official record sent a fresh jolt of anger through David. It was the clinical, bureaucratic language of the system he was now fighting. Jessica knew these recordings were a goldmine. "This is our timeline," she explained to David, pointing to the timestamps on the transcripts. "We can prove that Chris called for a supervisor to report Thorne's interference a full 3 minutes before Thorne called in the arrest. This wasn't a situation that suddenly escalated. It was a sustained course of conduct by Thorne." The tapes also revealed something else. Thorne never once called for a supervisor himself. In situations of interagency conflict, standard procedure was to request a commanding officer from both departments to come to the scene and mediate. Thorne had bypassed that entirely. He had taken it upon himself to be the judge, jury, and executioner of the situation. It was another piece of evidence that demonstrated his actions were driven by ego, not protocol. The combination of the body camera video and the dispatch audio created an airtight container around the city's defense. The video showed what happened. The audio proved when it happened and how it was reported in real time. Jessica's legal team created a synchronized presentation. They played the body camera footage on a large screen, and alongside it, they displayed the transcripts of the radio calls, with the relevant lines highlighted at the exact moment they were spoken. The effect was devastating. It was like watching a movie with the director's commentary, a commentary that pointed out every lie, every procedural failure, every moment of Thorne's malicious intent. When the city's lawyers were presented with this synchronized evidence during a pre-trial conference, the atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. The last vestiges of their arrogant confidence evaporated. They were looking at a case they could not possibly win in front of a jury. Their lead attorney asked for a recess. He came back 20 minutes later with a new offer: $1 million. It was a staggering amount of money. It was life-changing money. For a moment, David was tempted. He could end this nightmare, provide for his family, and put it all behind him. He looked at Jessica. She didn't say a word, her expression unreadable. She was leaving the decision entirely up to him. He thought about the recordings. He thought about Thorne's cold, calm voice describing him as a suspect. He thought about the fact that if it weren't for the recordings, the video, the audio, it would have been his word against a police officer's. And he knew who the system was designed to believe. "No," David said, his voice quiet but firm. "They're not just buying my silence. They need to change the way they do business. This goes to trial." The final critical piece of the case had nothing to do with law enforcement procedure or constitutional rights. It was about medicine. To win a substantial victory at trial, Jessica Hayes had to draw a direct, undeniable line between Officer Thorne's actions and the harm suffered by Robert Miller. Her star witness for this was Dr. Anya Sharma, the chief of trauma surgery at Tampa General Hospital. Dr. Sharma was a formidable presence. She was in her early 50s with a sharp, brilliant mind and a commanding aura honed by years of making life-or-death decisions in the operating room. She had been the lead surgeon who operated on Robert Miller that day. She had no allegiance to either side. Her only allegiance was to the medical facts. Her deposition was conducted via video conference. Jessica began by establishing Dr. Sharma's credentials, a long and impressive list of degrees, publications, and accolades. Then, she walked her through Robert Miller's case, from the moment he arrived in the ER to his current condition. "Dr. Sharma, can you describe Mr. Miller's state when he was brought to your trauma bay?" Jessica asked. "He was in extremis. Dr. Sharma stated, her voice clear and precise. He was unconscious, hypotensive, and in respiratory distress. He went into cardiac arrest within 2 minutes of arrival. What was the cause of the cardiac arrest? He had a severe tension pneumothorax on the left side. His lung had collapsed, and air was accumulating in his chest cavity, compressing his heart and the major blood vessels. It effectively prevented his heart from pumping blood. We had to perform an emergency needle decompression right there in the bay to relieve the pressure before we could even get his heart started again. And he also had a head injury, correct? Yes. A CT scan confirmed a large epidural hematoma, an active bleed between the skull and the dura, the lining of the brain. This also required immediate surgical intervention to evacuate the clot and stop the bleeding. Jessica paused before asking the most important question. Doctor, in your expert medical opinion, did the delay in his transport to the hospital have an impact on his condition and his ultimate outcome? The city's attorney immediately objected, but the judge who was presiding over the deposition allowed the question. Dr. Sharma did not hesitate. It had a profound impact, she said, her words carrying immense weight. In trauma, we have a concept called the golden hour, the critical period after an injury where prompt medical intervention has the highest likelihood of preventing death. In reality, for patients like Mr. Miller, it's more like the platinum 10 minutes. She continued, explaining in clear, accessible language the devastating cascade effect of the delay. With a tension pneumothorax, the pressure builds with every breath. A delay of, say, 8 to 10 minutes allows that pressure to reach a critical point, leading directly to cardiac arrest. Similarly, with an active epidural bleed, every minute that passes means more blood accumulating, more pressure on the brain, and more irreversible cell death. The patient's neurological outcome is directly tied to the speed of surgical intervention. So, to be clear, doctor, Jessica said, are you saying that if Mr. Miller had arrived at your hospital 10 minutes earlier, his prognosis would have been different? It is my professional opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, that it would have been substantially different, Dr. Sharma affirmed. He would have been in surgery before the tension pneumothorax led to cardiac arrest. We would have evacuated the hematoma before the intracranial pressure reached a level that caused significant, permanent cognitive damage. He may still have had a long recovery, but the severity of the outcome was directly exacerbated by the delay in transport. It was the medical nail in the city's coffin. Dr. Sharma's testimony was unimpeachable. She wasn't a hired gun. She was the treating physician, a respected expert with no agenda other than the truth. She had scientifically and authoritatively connected Thorne's roadside power trip to Robert Miller's catastrophic injuries. Her expert report, a detailed 20-page document outlining these findings, was submitted as evidence. When combined with the body cam video and the dispatch logs, it created a narrative that was not just compelling, but scientifically irrefutable. The city knew it was beaten. They had no medical expert who could credibly refute the claims of the actual surgeon who had saved the man's life. Their defense was in shambles. They were facing a jury trial with a sympathetic hero as the plaintiff, a damning video as the star exhibit, and now a world-class surgeon as the expert witness. Their legal liability was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. The only question left was how much a jury would make them pay for it. The trial began on a sweltering Monday in June in a federal courtroom in the Sam M. Gibbons U.S. Courthouse in downtown Tampa. The air inside was cold with air conditioning and thick with anticipation. David Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing the same simple gray suit he had worn every day of the proceedings. He looked directly at the jury, a panel of 8 ordinary citizens who held his fate and the city's finances in their hands. Jessica Hayes's opening statement was a masterpiece of storytelling. She didn't begin with legal arguments or constitutional amendments. She began with David. She told the jury about his service as a Navy corpsman, about his dedication to his community, about the hundreds of lives he had saved. She painted a picture of a consummate professional. Then, she introduced them to Robert Miller, a husband and father, a construction manager who was on his way to a job site when his life was shattered. Only then did she introduce Officer Mark Thorne. She described his actions not with hyperbole, but with cold, factual precision. She laid out the timeline of the events, promising the jury that the evidence would show not just a mistake, but a deliberate and malicious abuse of authority. This case, she concluded, her voice ringing with conviction, is about a simple fundamental principle. No one is above the law, not even the people who wear a badge. The city's attorney, by contrast, was defensive from the start. He attempted to portray Officer Thorne as a diligent officer trying to maintain order at a chaotic scene, and David as an emotional, uncooperative paramedic who had needlessly escalated the situation. It was a narrative that was already crumbling under the weight of the evidence to come. The trial lasted 5 days. Jessica called her witnesses one by one. Chris Riley, David's partner, gave a clear, step-by-step account of the confrontation, his testimony filled with the righteous anger of a man who had watched his friend and partner be unjustly arrested. The firefighters, Miller and Sanchez, were even more powerful. These were tough, veteran first responders, men who were not easily shaken. They described Thorne's actions as the most unprofessional and dangerous behavior they had ever witnessed at an emergency scene. He had tunnel vision, Miller testified. All he cared about was that ambulance. He didn't seem to care at all about the man dying in the car. But the most dramatic moment of the trial came when Jessica played the body camera footage. The courtroom was silent, the only sound the audio from the video. The jurors were transfixed, their eyes glued to the large monitor. They saw the scene through Thorne's eyes. They saw David's desperate attempts to treat his patient. They heard Robert Miller's labored breathing. They saw Thorne's aggressive posture, heard his escalating demands. And they saw the moment he yanked David from the car, slamming him against the wreck. Several jurors flinched. One woman put her hand to her mouth. The video did what no amount of testimony could. It transported the jury to that stretch of asphalt on Dale Mabry Highway. It made them witnesses. They were no longer just hearing about an injustice, they were seeing it unfold before their very eyes. The city's defense was weak. When Officer Thorne took the stand, he was a shadow of the confident man from the deposition. Under Jessica's withering cross-examination, he came across as defensive, arrogant, and completely lacking in remorse. He stuck to his story that he was just following procedure, but the jury had seen the video. They knew what they had seen. The final witness was Dr. Anya Sharma, who testified via a pre-recorded video deposition. She calmly and methodically explained the medical consequences of the delay, her expert opinion landing with the force of an unshakable truth. In her closing argument, Jessica tied it all together. She played a short, silent clip from the body cam video, the moment Thorne put the handcuffs on David. She let the image linger on the screen. "This," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "is what happens when ego is allowed to override duty. This is what happens when a public servant forgets who they are meant to serve." She then turned to the jury. "Your verdict in this case will do more than just compensate David Carter for the injustice he suffered. It will send a message to the city of Tampa and to law enforcement agencies everywhere that the men and women who save lives for a living deserve to be protected, not punished. It will affirm that at the scene of an emergency, there is only one thing that matters: the patient." As the jury filed out to begin their deliberations, David looked at their faces. They were ordinary people, a retired teacher, a postal worker, a small business owner. But in that moment, they held extraordinary power. The power to right a wrong, the power to deliver justice. The wait for the jury's verdict was the longest 4 hours of David Carter's life. He sat with Jessica and Sarah in a small, windowless conference room, the silence broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. He tried to read a magazine, but the words blurred together. He tried to make small talk, but the conversation felt forced. Every possible outcome ran through his mind. What if they didn't believe him? What if they sided with the officer? Finally, a bailiff stuck his head in the door. "They have a verdict." David's heart hammered against his ribs as they walked back into the courtroom. The air was electric. Officer Thorne and his lawyers were already at their table, their faces grim. The jury filed back into the box, their expressions unreadable. They refused to make eye contact with either table, a fact that Jessica had told him could mean anything. "All rise," the clerk said as the judge took the bench. "Mr. Foreman, has the jury reached a verdict?" A man in the front row, the retired teacher, stood up. He held a piece of paper in his slightly trembling hand. "We have, Your Honor. On the claim of unlawful seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment, how do you find?" "We find for the plaintiff, David Carter." A quiet gasp went through the courtroom. Sarah squeezed David's hand so hard he thought his knuckles would crack. "On the claim of false arrest, how do you find?" "We find for the plaintiff, David Carter." "And on the claim of violation of due process under the 14th Amendment, how do you find?" "We find for the plaintiff, David Carter." It was a clean sweep. They had won on all counts. But the most important part was yet to come: the damages. The judge turned to the foreman. "And what amount of compensatory and punitive damages do you award to the plaintiff?" The foreman cleared his throat and read from the paper. "The jury awards compensatory damages in the amount of $4,900,000. And we award punitive damages against the defendants in the amount of $7 million. The number hung in the air, stunning the courtroom into absolute silence. $11.9 million. It was an astronomical sum, far beyond what even Jessica had dared to hope for. It was more than just a verdict. It was a reckoning. It was a punishment. The jury hadn't just sought to compensate David, they had sought to penalize the city and Officer Thorne for their malicious conduct. David felt the breath leave his body in a rush. He slumped back in his chair, the tension of the past year draining out of him, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of relief and vindication. Sarah was openly weeping beside him. Across the aisle, the city's legal team looked shell-shocked. Officer Thorne stared straight ahead, his face pale, his career and reputation in ruins. The verdict was a thunderclap that echoed far beyond the walls of the courthouse. It was the lead story on every local news station and was quickly picked up by national outlets. The city of Tampa was now facing not only a massive financial payout, but also a public relations nightmare of its own making. Their decision to defend Thorne, to downplay the incident, had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. The message sent by the jury was loud and clear. Accountability has a price. They had listened to the evidence, they had seen the video, and they had decided that the city's failure to properly train and supervise its officers and its subsequent defense of an officer who had so clearly abused his power demanded a severe penalty. That evening, David didn't want to celebrate. He just wanted to be home. He sat on his back porch with Sarah, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The legal battle was over. He had been proven right in the most definitive way imaginable, but the victory felt hollow in some ways. It wouldn't undo the damage to Robert Miller. It wouldn't erase the memory of the handcuffs, the holding cell, the humiliation. But it was a start. It was a clear, unambiguous statement that what had happened to him was wrong. And as his story spread, he began to realize that this victory wasn't just his. It was a victory for every paramedic, every first responder who had ever been put in an impossible situation by an officer on a power trip. The jury's verdict had drawn a line in the sand, a line that was now worth nearly $12 million. The fallout from the verdict was swift and widespread. The city of Tampa, facing immense public pressure and a staggering financial liability, did not appeal. They paid the settlement. Officer Mark Thorne was fired from the Tampa Police Department, the internal affairs investigation finally concluding that he had violated multiple departmental policies, including conduct unbecoming of an officer and abuse of authority. But the impact of David Carter's case went far beyond a single officer's career or a single city's budget. The story had touched a nerve, not just in Florida, but across the country. First responder unions and professional organizations who had been quietly dealing with incidents of police interference for years saw an opportunity. David's case, with its dramatic video evidence and massive verdict, was the perfect catalyst for change. A coalition of organizations, led by the Florida Association of Professional EMTs and Paramedics, began lobbying state legislators in Tallahassee. Their goal was to create a new law that would provide explicit legal protection for emergency medical personnel in the line of duty. They used David's body cam footage in their presentations, showing lawmakers the terrifying reality of what could happen when police authority clashed with medical necessity. David was asked to testify before a state Senate committee. He was nervous, standing before a panel of powerful politicians, but he simply told his story. He spoke about his training, his duty to his patient, and the impossible choice he had been forced to make. He ended his testimony with a simple, powerful plea. No paramedic should ever have to choose between their patient's life and their own freedom, he said. We need a law that makes it clear that when we are performing our duties, patient care comes first. Period. His testimony was incredibly effective. So was the testimony of Robert Miller, who, despite his ongoing health challenges, made the trip to Tallahassee. He spoke in slow, deliberate tones, the cognitive damage from his injury still apparent. He told the legislators what it was like to wake up from a coma and learn that the man who saved his life had been arrested for doing so. He fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself, Miller said, his voice thick with emotion. Now it's our turn to fight for him and for all the others like him. The combination of their stories and the looming threat of more multi-million-dollar lawsuits was enough to spur the legislature into action. A bipartisan bill was drafted, a bill that would come to be known informally as the First Responder Shield Act. The law did several key things. First, it explicitly criminalized the act of intentionally or knowingly interfering with an on-duty emergency medical technician or paramedic providing medical care. Second, it granted paramedics a degree of scene authority in medical emergencies, stipulating that law enforcement could not countermand a paramedic's medical decisions regarding patient treatment or transport unless there was an immediate threat to public safety. Finally, it mandated new, statewide training for all law enforcement recruits on how to properly interact with EMS personnel at emergency scenes. The bill passed both the Florida House and Senate with overwhelming majorities. 6 months after the trial, David Carter stood in the governor's office in Tallahassee beside his wife, Jessica Hayes, and Robert Miller. He watched as the governor signed the First Responder Shield Act into law. The governor handed David one of the pens he had used to sign the bill. "Thank you for your courage, Mr. Carter," the governor said. "You've made every first responder in this state safer." The law became a model for other states. Legislators in Georgia, Texas, and North Carolina introduced similar bills, all citing the Carter case in Tampa as the impetus. David's personal nightmare had transformed into a national movement for reform. The Tampa Police Department, under immense pressure, also implemented sweeping changes to its own policies and training, creating a new protocol for police EMS interaction that became a national standard. David was even invited, by a new police chief who had replaced the old one, to speak to academy classes of new recruits, to share his story and help them understand the paramedic's perspective. It was a strange and unexpected turn of events. He had never sought to be an advocate or a symbol. He was just a paramedic who wanted to do his job. But by standing his ground on that stretch of highway, he had inadvertently forced a system to look in the mirror and confront its own failings. The law that now bore his unofficial name was a legacy he had never asked for, but it was one he carried with immense pride. It was a shield, not just for him, but for the thousands of men and women who would come after him, ensuring that the click of cold steel would never again be the reward for saving a life. Life, for David Carter, eventually found a new kind of normal. He returned to work at Ambulance 22, riding alongside his partner, Chris. He still responded to the same calls, treated the same kinds of injuries, and navigated the same city streets. But something inside him had fundamentally shifted. The job was the same, but the man doing it was different. He carried the scars of his ordeal. Whenever a police car pulled up to one of his scenes, he felt a familiar spike of anxiety, a tensing in his shoulders that he had to consciously breathe through. He was more cautious in his interactions with law enforcement, more deliberate in his language, always aware that a situation could turn sideways in an instant. The trust he once had, the easy camaraderie between fellow first responders had been damaged. It was a wound that healed slowly. A portion of the settlement money went to the Miller family, helping to cover the immense, lifelong costs of Robert's medical care. David and Robert had formed an unlikely, powerful bond. Two men whose lives had become forever intertwined on a stretch of hot asphalt. The rest of the money provided David and Sarah with a level of security they had never imagined, but it never felt like a lottery win. It felt like what it was: compensation for a trauma. David used his newfound platform not for fame, but for education. He worked with the National Association of EMTs to develop training materials based on his experience. His body cam footage, once a source of personal humiliation, became one of the most effective training tools in the country. Police academies and paramedic schools alike used it to teach recruits about de-escalation, interagency cooperation, and the critical importance of respecting professional boundaries. The footage showed, in stark, unflinching detail, how a routine emergency could devolve into a civil rights disaster. Instructors would pause the video and ask their students, "What would you have done differently here?" For police recruits, it was a lesson in humility and situational awareness. For paramedic students, it was a lesson in assertiveness and patient advocacy. David's story became a quiet legend within the EMS community. It was told in ambulance bays and fire station kitchens across the country. It was a cautionary tale, but it was also a story of empowerment. It was proof that one person, armed with the truth and a commitment to their principles, could fight the system and win. It validated the gut feeling of every paramedic who had ever felt bullied or dismissed at a scene. It gave them a new language to use, a new precedent to stand on. "Remember what happened to that guy in Tampa," a training officer might say. "Know your rights. Protect your patient." Years went by. The First Responder Shield Act became an established part of Florida law. The new police training protocols became ingrained in the culture of the Tampa PD. New paramedics and police officers joined the ranks, ones who had only ever known a world where the rules born from David's case were the standard. The system had, in its own slow, grinding way, adapted. David never saw Mark Thorne again. He heard through the grapevine that Thorne had moved out of state, unable to find work in law enforcement again. There was no satisfaction in this knowledge for David, only a sense of waste. A wasted career, a shattered life for Robert Miller, a loss of public trust, all because one man couldn't handle being told no. It was a tragedy, in the truest sense of the word. One afternoon, about 5 years after the trial, David was at a coffee shop when a young man in a paramedic student uniform approached him hesitantly. "Excuse me," the student said. "You're David Carter, aren't you?" David nodded. "Wow, we just watched your video in class yesterday," the student said, his eyes wide with a kind of hero worship. "I just wanted to say thank you. What you did, it changed things for all of us." David simply smiled and shook the young man's hand. The legal battle was a distant memory. The money was in the bank. The anger had mostly faded, replaced by a quiet, resilient peace. But this was the real legacy. Not the millions of dollars or the headlines, but the knowledge that a new generation of lifesavers would step into the field better prepared, better protected, and more empowered to do their sacred work because of the stand he took on one awful, sun-drenched Tuesday morning. He had done more than just save Robert Miller's life. He had, in a small but meaningful way, helped protect the future of his entire profession. When we look back on that day, it's easy to focus on the clash of uniforms, the screaming sirens, and the cold, hard number of the final verdict. But the real story began long before that, in the mind of one officer. What leads a person entrusted with immense power to misuse it so profoundly? For Mark Thorne, the answer likely lies in a potent, toxic cocktail of insecurity and a flawed, rigid understanding of authority. His world was built on a foundation of immediate compliance. The badge wasn't just a symbol of public trust, it was a shield for his own ego. When David Carter, another professional in a uniform, presented a higher, more urgent authority, the authority of a medical imperative, Thorne didn't see a colleague saving a life. He saw a threat to his own status. His actions weren't a rational response to a logistical problem. They were the lashing out of a man terrified of appearing weak or irrelevant in a situation he couldn't control. Could David have done anything differently? It's a question that haunts anyone who has ever faced an impossible choice. Perhaps if he had used a different tone, a more supplicating one, Thorne might have backed down. Perhaps if he had immediately abandoned his patient to plead with the officer, the arrest could have been avoided. But those hypotheticals lead to a darker reality. If he had done any of those things, Robert Miller might have died on the asphalt. David made the only choice a true medic could make. He chose his patient. The tragedy is that the system, in that moment, was designed to punish him for it. His only path to better protection wasn't to change his actions on that day, but to endure the fight that followed, creating a new set of rules so others wouldn't face the same broken system. Ultimately, this story is a stark reminder that true authority isn't demanded. It's earned through wisdom, compassion, and respect for others. It teaches us that the most important laws are not always the ones written in books, but the unwritten moral laws that compel us to protect the vulnerable, to prioritize life above all else, and to have the courage to stand up to injustice, no matter the uniform it wears. What do you think is the best way to ensure accountability when different emergency services have to work together under pressure? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone's ego got in the way of the right decision being made? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please support the channel so we can continue to bring you these important stories.